All right, let's dive headfirst into some philosophy of mind, shall we? Today we're going deep on consciousness and intentionality. Two concepts that are guaranteed to get any philosopher's brain buzzing.
I know, right?
You've given us a ton of sources on this. And even defining these terms, well, it's pretty complicated. Lots of debate there.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this together and see if we can kind of distill what's at the heart of these ideas.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, these are questions that have really been around for centuries, haven't they? And we're still grappling with them.
Oh, for sure.
But that's part of the beauty of it, I think. It forces us to really confront the nature of our own minds.
Absolutely.
So where should we begin?
Well, I guess let's start with consciousness itself. I mean, it seems like a simple enough concept on the surface, right? We all know what it's like to experience the world.
Yeah.
But as soon as you try to, really pin down what that experience actually is, things get really slippery.
Absolutely. Consciousness is about what it's like to be in a certain mental state. That's subjective, qualitative feel of experience.
Right.
So think about things like, the feeling of pain, the sensation of seeing red, or even the thought of your next vacation. All of these are examples of conscious experiences.
But, one of the sources pointed out that even defining experience is like a philosophical minefield in itself.
It is.
Some philosophers argue that certain types of mental activity, like episodic thought, aren't even the same kind of experience as, raw sensation.
Yeah.
And then others, they think the concept of experience is it's too messy to even be useful. It's just.
Yeah, that's a great point. It shows you how fundamental these debates really are.
Yeah.
We're questioning the very foundation of what it means to have a mind to experience the world.
Exactly.
But I guess for the sake of this deep dive, let's assume we have a working understanding of what experience is.
Okay.
Now, how does intentionality fit into all of this?
Well, it seems like the sources agree that intentionality is all about the aboutness of mental states.
Yeah.
It's the way our thoughts, our beliefs, desires, perceptions, the way they're directed towards something.
Yeah.
They have this they're pointing at something.
They are. And that pointing is crucial.
Yeah.
It suggests that our minds aren't just these isolated bubbles of experience.
Right.
They're reaching out. They're connecting with and representing the world around us.
Absolutely.
So, think about how your belief that the earth is round, that belief is about the earth, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or how your desire for a cup of coffee, that's about the taste and the aroma of the coffee. It has that directedness.
Right. And it's not just about abstract concepts or desires either.
No.
Even our perceptions have this intentional quality. One of the sources uses the example of perceptual constancy.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how we perceive things as having these stable properties, like their shape and their color, even though the lighting and our viewing angle and even our own internal states are constantly changing.
Right. What's fascinating about that is that it suggests our minds are doing something really quite sophisticated.
Yeah.
They're actively constructing this stable representation of the world, even as the raw sensory data is in constant flux.
Wow.
So that constancy through flux really highlights the power of intentionality.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got this basic idea then that intentionality is about this aboutness of mental states.
Right.
But one of the sources mentions a few different ways that philosophers understand this aboutness.
You do.
We talked about directedness, but there's also this idea of conditions of satisfaction and mental content.
Yes.
Can you break those down for us a little bit?
Sure. So think of it like this. Every belief, every desire, every intention has a set of conditions that would need to be met for it to be fulfilled or satisfied.
Oh, yeah.
So for example, if you desire a delicious meal, the condition of satisfaction for that desire is that you actually eat a delicious meal.
Makes sense.
Not just think about it.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
those conditions of satisfaction are like the target,
Yeah.
the goal,
Yeah.
the goal of that mental state.
Precisely. Now, mental content is very closely related to that.
Uh-huh.
It's essentially what a mental state represents.
Okay.
It's often described as the meaning of that state.
Okay.
So if your belief is that the earth is round, the mental content is the representation of the earth as being round.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
But the source also kind of hints that there's a lot of philosophical debate about this whole idea of content.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
It's not always that straightforward.
No, there are tons of debates about how content relates to those satisfaction conditions.
Yeah.
How the context can influence the content.
Yeah.
And even whether content can be non-conceptual, like the raw feeling of a sensation. But I think we can save those complexities for another time. For now, let's focus on the big picture.
All right.
How do consciousness and intentionality relate to each other?
Well, the sources frame this as like a central debate in the philosophy of mind, don't they?
Yeah.
Are consciousness and intentionality inseparable, or can you have one without the other?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. So, the view that they're inseparable is called intentionalism.
Right.
And it claims that the very nature of conscious experience always involves some form of intentionality.
So every time you experience something, you're also experiencing it as something. There's always that aboutness, even if it's subtle.
Exactly.
Okay.
But then, on the other side of the debate, we have separatism.
Right.
And this view says it's possible to have conscious experiences that aren't about anything at all. Think of them like pure, raw feels.
Okay.
So sensations that exist without representing anything specific.
So a separatist might say that the experience of a certain shade of blue, it's just a pure sensation, a raw feel, not about anything else in the world.
Precisely. Now, separatism had a really strong hold in the 20th century, in analytic philosophy in particular, thanks in part to figures like Ryle and Wittgenstein.
Oh, right. Those philosophical giants. They really shifted the focus away from the subjective experience, didn't they? Towards the more public, rule-governed aspects of language and thought.
They did, and their work led a lot of philosophers to downplay consciousness altogether and embrace this idea of separatism. They argued that the real action in the mind was all about thinking, reasoning, and understanding language. All activities that are intentional, but not necessarily tied to subjective experience.
But intentionalism didn't just disappear, right? It seems like it's had a resurgence in recent decades.
It absolutely has. And what's even more fascinating is that intentionalism itself isn't just one single view. It's a whole spectrum of different positions.
Wait, so we're going meta now. Intentionalism is like a spectrum of different types of intentionalism.
Well, it wouldn't be philosophy without layers of complexity.
Here's the truth.
But don't worry, it's actually pretty intuitive once you break it down.
Okay.
One of the key distinctions within intentionalism is between externalist and internalist views.
Okay, so externalist intentionalism would say that the meaning of our thoughts and experiences, that depends on our connection to the world outside our minds.
Exactly. It argues that the content of our experiences isn't just determined by what's going on inside our heads,
Right.
but by our relationship to the environment, to our language community, to our causal history.
It's like our minds are embedded in the world.
Exactly.
And that leads to some pretty mind-bending thought experiments, like the classic brain in a vat scenario.
Absolutely, yeah. The brain in a vat, it's a staple of philosophy of mind. Imagine a brain that's been removed from a body and placed in a vat of nutrients, right?
Right.
And it's hooked up to a supercomputer that simulates a complete realistic world.
Yeah.
And the brain experiences this simulated world as if it were real.
And this thought experiment really challenges the externalist views, doesn't it? Because even though the brain is completely detached from the real world, its experiences still seem to be about something.
They do. So how can we say that the content of those experiences is determined by external factors if there are no external factors?
Right.
It's a great question, and it highlights the tension between these internal and external aspects of intentionality.
Yeah, it really does.
But it gets even more complex when we start to consider the different ways that intentionalism can be reductive or non-reductive.
Okay, so reductive intentionalism would be the view that we can fully explain consciousness in terms of intentionality.
Yeah.
Essentially saying that consciousness is nothing more than a specific kind of intentional state.
Exactly. It's looking for a way to account for consciousness without appealing to anything beyond the realm of intentionality.
Right.
And this is where the famous zombie argument often comes up.
Ugh. Ah, yes. The philosophical zombie. A classic. For those who haven't encountered it before, imagine a creature that is physically identical to a human.
Yeah.
It looks, acts, and talks like a human, but it lacks any conscious experience whatsoever.
Right.
It's like this walking, talking bundle of intentionality, but with no inner world.
And if such a zombie is even conceivable, it throws a real wrench into the gears of reductive intentionalism.
Right.
Because if you can have intentionality without consciousness, then consciousness can't simply be reduced to a particular kind of intentional state.
This is all getting pretty intense. Maybe we need a moment to process all of this before we dive into the next layer of the onion.
That's a good idea. These are definitely concepts that require careful consideration. Let's take a short break and then come back to explore the spectrum of intentionalism and the nuances of how much cognitive content is packed into our conscious experiences.
Sounds good to me. Okay, my brain is definitely ready for some more of these philosophical adventures. Last time we left off, we were going to explore these different flavors of intentionalism.
Right.
And how they deal with this question of just how much cognitive content is actually part of our conscious experience.
Yeah. And this is where things start to get, really interesting. We've
Yeah.
been talking about how our mental states are directed at things, right? How they're about something.
Right.
But how much of that aboutness is actually present in our conscious awareness?
Right. So it seems like some intentionalists, they take a pretty minimalist view, don't they? They argue that only the basic sensory information is really part of the conscious experience,
Right.
like the raw data of our senses,
Mm.
colors, shapes, sounds, textures.
Exactly.
And they see these higher level thoughts, concepts, judgments, all of that. They see that as being separate from that immediate sensory experience.
Right. So think of it like this. A restrictive intentionalist might say that the experience of seeing a dog, for example, is limited to the visual data. So the shape, the color, the movement.
Yeah.
But the concept of dog itself, the understanding of what a dog is, wouldn't be part of that immediate experience.
Okay.
That would be a separate cognitive process.
So for them, there's a distinction between the raw sensation of seeing something dog-shaped and the cognitive act of categorizing it as a dog.
Precisely. But then you have other intentionalists who argue for a much more inclusive view of consciousness.
Okay.
So they suggest that experience can be much richer.
Okay.
It can encompass thoughts, concepts, and understanding right alongside those basic sensations.
So for them, seeing a dog wouldn't just be about the visual data. It would also involve the concept of dog.
Yeah.
Maybe even memories of past encounters with dogs.
Right.
And judgments about the dog's breed or temperament, all sorts of things.
Exactly. And this debate over how much is packed into experience often leads to questions about what philosophers call cognitive phenomenology.
Okay.
And this is a really hot topic in philosophy of mind right now.
I could imagine.
So the question is, do our thoughts have a distinct feel to them? Does understanding something feel different from simply sensing it?
I love how meta this gets. It's like we're trying to introspect on the act of thinking itself.
It is.
We're trying to pin down the subjective experience of having a thought.
Absolutely. It's a very slippery concept.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. Think about some concrete examples.
Okay.
Does it feel different to understand an ambiguous sentence in one way versus another way?
Ah.
Or does reading something feel different when you understand it compared to when it's just a jumble of words?
Well, those are great examples. It makes me pay more attention to those subtle shifts in my own experience when I'm trying to grasp a new idea.
Yeah.
Like when a sentence suddenly clicks into place and I get it. Does that feel different from the moments of confusion leading up to that? I don't know.
And how we answer those questions about cognitive phenomenology often depends on what we think concepts are, how we acquire them and how we use them. But let's move on to another really fascinating dimension of this whole consciousness and intentionality puzzle.
All right. Lead the way.
Okay, so our sources also delved into the relationship between consciousness and self-consciousness.
Okay.
They highlighted 3 key questions from the phenomenological tradition.
Okay.
First, is consciousness always in some way consciousness of itself?
Okay.
Second, is it only in reflection that conscious states become objects for the one experiencing them?
Right.
And third, does consciousness ordinarily involve this non-reflective consciousness of oneself as subject?
Whoa. Those are some pretty dense questions. It's like we're asking if consciousness needs a mirror to even see itself.
It is. It is a bit like that.
Or if it's always inherently self-aware.
Right. And the answers to these questions can really shape our whole understanding of what consciousness is and how it works.
Okay.
So, for example, you have these theories called higher order theories
Okay.
that answer yes to the first question and no to the second.
So higher order theories would say that consciousness is inherently reflexive.
Yeah.
It's always, in some sense, aware of itself.
Yeah.
But that awareness doesn't require us to, explicitly reflect on our own mental state.
Exactly. These theories argue that to be conscious of something is to represent your own mental states in a certain way.
Okay.
So being conscious of pain, for example, means that your mind is representing the state of being in pain.
It's like your consciousness is forming a thought about the experience itself.
Yeah.
It's a second-order awareness.
Precisely. But this view runs into some interesting challenges when we consider the fact that our self-awareness isn't always accurate.
Right.
We can misinterpret our own mental states.
Oh, for sure.
So what happens when you think you're in pain, but you're actually not?
Yeah.
How does that fit into this framework?
That's a great point. our minds can play tricks on us. I remember that one time I was completely convinced I had a fever, and the thermometer proved me totally wrong. I was so sure that I felt feverish, but I was completely mistaken.
Exactly. And cases like this, where we misjudge our own mental states, they create problems for these higher order theories.
Yeah.
Because they suggest that consciousness isn't always a perfect mirror of what's happening in our minds.
Right.
There's room for error, for illusion, even for self-deception.
It's amazing how much complexity there is to something that we usually take for granted, like simply being aware of the world and ourselves.
It really is, and it gets even deeper when we broaden the scope and ask how central consciousness is to having a mind at all.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and consider that question.
All right.
What are the stakes here?
Well, some philosophers would argue that consciousness is what makes a mind truly mine.
Okay.
Without consciousness, they'd say our mental states would just be physical processes,
Yeah.
lacking any subjective owner.
So there'd be no I to even experience them.
Exactly.
So consciousness is like the glue that binds our mental states together and gives them this sense of belonging to a subject.
Yeah.
Without it, we'd be like, I don't know, a jumbled collection of thoughts and sensations.
Yeah.
With no one home to experience them.
Exactly. Others would say that consciousness is crucial for rational thought and justified belief.
Okay.
They'd say, without the ability to reflect on our own thoughts, how could we properly evaluate them?
Right.
Determine whether they're true or false?
Yeah.
How could we make reasoned judgments or have these well-grounded beliefs?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like consciousness provides the space for that critical thinking.
Right.
Where we can step back from our thoughts and assess them.
Yeah.
Rather than just being swept along by them.
Exactly. And this leads us to some pretty weighty ethical questions as well, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Does consciousness have inherent value? Does the moral status of a person change if their consciousness is gone, even if their body is still functioning?
I mean, now we're getting into some really deep philosophical waters here. This is where those classic thought experiments can be helpful, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Like, would you rather be a happy zombie or a conscious being with less happiness?
Exactly. Those kinds of thought experiments really force us to examine our intuitions about what matters when it comes to consciousness.
For sure.
And the answers we come up with, they're likely to be influenced by how rich and complex we think consciousness is.
Yeah, absolutely. This is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit, my brain is starting to feel a bit overloaded.
I know, right?
Maybe we should pause here for a second and give our listener a chance to digest all of this before we move on to the final part of our deep dive.
I think that's a wise idea. These are concepts that deserve careful consideration. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and explore the implications of all this for our understanding of the mind, the self, and the very nature of reality.
Okay, we're back, ready for the final part of our consciousness deep dive. I'm really excited to see where all of this leads us. So far, we've been exploring the nature of consciousness and intentionality, right? And how those two concepts intertwine. But now I'm kind of curious to see how this all fits into the bigger picture of the mind itself.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that's challenged philosophers, for centuries, really. How does consciousness, the subjective experience of the world, how does it relate to the mind as a whole?
Yeah.
Where do we draw the boundaries of the conscious mind? And how does intentionality, this aboutness of our thoughts, play into all of this?
Right. It feels like we've been examining these individual threads, of consciousness intentionality.
Right.
And now we need to kind of zoom out and see how they weave together to form the tapestry of the mind.
Exactly. And, you'll notice that the picture of the mind that emerges, it often depends on your stance in that intentionality debate we were talking about earlier. For instance, if you lean towards separatism, the view that consciousness and intentionality are distinct, you might end up with a somewhat fragmented view of the mind.
Okay.
You've got those raw feels of consciousness on one side.
Yeah.
And then the intentional, representational aspects of mental life on the other.
So for a separatist, there's this fundamental division then between the subjective, experiential part of the mind and the part that's about, thinking, believing, representing the world.
Precisely. And this raises some tricky questions about how those two parts interact, or if they even do. But even if you move away from separatism and embrace some form of intentionalism, the view that consciousness always involves some form of intentionality, you still face choices about where to draw the boundaries of the conscious mind.
Right. Earlier we talked about how some intentionalists take a restrictive view of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Limiting it to that basic sensory information. That would imply a pretty narrow scope for the conscious mind, wouldn't it?
It would. And that leads to some interesting puzzles about how much of our mental life is actually conscious.
Right.
For example, think about all the complex cognitive processes that happen below the level of conscious awareness.
Right.
Things like language processing, motor control, even some forms of decision making. All of these things seem to occur without us being consciously aware of them.
Yeah, it's like there's a whole hidden world of mental activity going on beneath the surface of our conscious experience.
Exactly. And this raises questions about the role of consciousness in those processes. If they can happen without conscious awareness, then what is consciousness for? What does it add to the mix?
Those are really good questions. It makes you wonder if consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the mind.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. And things get even more complex when we bring in ideas like the extended mind hypothesis, which suggests that the mind isn't even confined to the boundaries of our skull.
Oh yeah, the extended mind. That is a mind bender for sure.
Yeah.
So the basic idea there is that things like our smartphones, notebooks, even other people, they can become part of our cognitive system,
Yeah.
right? So they're extending the reach of our minds beyond our physical bodies. It's like our minds are leaking out into the world.
It's a captivating thought, isn't it? And it raises all sorts of questions about how consciousness fits into that picture. If part of my mind is literally out there in the world, does consciousness extend out there too? Does my smartphone have a little bit of consciousness because it's helping me think?
Whoa, those are some wild questions.
Yeah.
It really blurs the lines between what's in here, in our heads, and what's out there in the world.
It does, and it gets even more profound when we start thinking about the self.
Right.
Where does the self fit into all of this? Is consciousness essential to having a self at all? Or can we imagine a self without consciousness?
These are huge questions. I mean, philosophers have been wrestling with them for ages.
Hmm.
Makes you wonder if consciousness is like a spotlight,
Yeah.
that illuminates the self, or if the self exists independently of that spotlight.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And our views on the relationship between consciousness, intentionality, and the mind will undoubtedly influence how we answer those questions about the self. But let's shift gears for a moment. We've been talking a lot about what consciousness and intentionality are, but I think it's also important to consider their explanatory power.
Okay.
What can we actually explain using these concepts?
Right, right. We need to consider what we explain using these concepts, but also what is itself explained by appealing to them.
Exactly. So let's start with those who favor reductive intentionalism about consciousness. They would say that we explain consciousness by reducing it to a specific type of intentionality or mental representation. And then they aim to explain those representational states in a way that doesn't rely on consciousness itself.
So it's a two-step process.
Yeah.
First, reduce consciousness to intentionality.
Right.
Then explain intentionality in a way that doesn't presuppose consciousness.
Right. But of course, things aren't quite that simple. Even for reductive intentionalists, consciousness still plays a role in explaining how intentionality arises in the first place.
Right.
They would argue that consciousness emerges when you have the right kind of mental representation,
Yeah.
and that this explains how our minds become directed towards the world.
So even if you're trying to explain consciousness away, you still needed to explain how we get intentionality in the first place.
Precisely. And on the flip side, even non-reductive intentionalists, those who don't think consciousness can be fully reduced to intentionality, they might still use intentionality to explain certain aspects of consciousness. They could argue that understanding how conscious experience is structured and directed helps us make sense of its role in our mental lives.
So no matter where you stand on that reductive, non-reductive debate, both consciousness and intentionality can play a role in explaining various aspects of the mind.
Yeah. And the explanatory power of these concepts will also be influenced by how rich we think conscious experience is.
Right.
Remember our discussion about cognitive phenomenology. The more cognitive content we pack into experience, thoughts, concepts, judgments, all of that, the more we can potentially explain using consciousness.
Right. So the richer our conception of consciousness, the more explanatory work it can do. But what about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world?
Yeah.
How do we explain the emergence of something as seemingly subjective and immaterial as consciousness from the physical stuff of the brain?
Yes, the mind-body problem. This is where things get especially tricky. Many philosophers, especially those working within the analytic tradition, are committed to physicalism. the belief that everything in the universe, including consciousness, is ultimately grounded in physical processes.
So how do they bridge the gap between the physical and the mental? How does the brain, a physical organ made of cells and chemicals, give rise to something as intangible as consciousness?
That's the million-dollar question, and there is no easy answer. Some physicalists, they try to find specific types of brain activity that correlate with conscious experience, hoping to identify the neural signature of consciousness.
It's like looking for the neural footprints of subjective experience.
Exactly. Others argue that we need to look beyond individual neurons and focus on the complex interactions and patterns of activity within the brain as a whole.
So it's like trying to understand the emergent properties of a complex system.
Right.
Consciousness might be more like a symphony of neural activity, rather than a solo played by a single neuron.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it highlights how explaining consciousness will likely require a deep understanding of both the micro-level workings of the brain and the macro-level dynamics of these cognitive processes. But ultimately, the question of how consciousness arises from the physical world remains one of the most profound mysteries in all of science and philosophy.
So where do we go from here? After all this philosophical heavy lifting, what's the takeaway for our listener? What should they be pondering as they walk away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that consciousness is still very much an enigma. We've explored a range of fascinating theories and arguments, but there's no single universally accepted answer to the question of what consciousness is or how it arises.
It's like we've illuminated a few corners of a vast, unexplored cavern.
Yeah.
There's still so much darkness, so much we just don't know.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so enthralling.
Yeah.
There are so many avenues left to explore, so many puzzles to solve. And the pursuit of these answers might lead us to rethink not only the nature of mind, but also our place in the universe.
It's both humbling and exhilarating to realize that something as familiar as our own conscious experience is still so deeply mysterious. It's a reminder that we are, in a sense, living, breathing enigmas. We're beings capable of pondering our own existence, yet the very source of that pondering remains elusive.
Perhaps a final thought to leave with you is this. Throughout our discussion, we've focused on the relationship between consciousness and intentionality. We've explored how these concepts intertwine and shape our understanding of mind, self, and world. But what if we considered the possibility that consciousness itself is more fundamental than intentionality? What if, instead of intentionality being the key to unlocking the mysteries of consciousness, it's consciousness that gives rise to intentionality?
Wow, that's a really provocative idea, a complete reversal of the framework we've been working with. Instead of intentionality explaining consciousness, it's consciousness that explains intentionality. It's a reminder that, the most fundamental questions in philosophy, they're rarely settled. And every answer often opens up a whole new set of questions.
Indeed, the exploration never truly ends.
So, to our listener out there, I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, question your assumptions, and embrace the mystery of consciousness. Who knows what incredible insights you might uncover along the way. This has been The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring.